And exactly 1 month since Donald Trump sent the most disruptive tweet of his presidency. It said, "Terrible, just found out that Obama had my wires tapped in Trump Tower just before the victory. Nothing found. This is McCarthyism." The most disruptive and the most insane tweet of his presidency. That tweet has provoked investigative action by the House Intelligence Committee, which is in the hands of Chairman Devin Nunes. He has turned that into a corrupt-looking gang that couldn't shoot straight farce, which would be funny if the underlying issues weren't so serious. A president of the United States and/or his campaign team and/or his transition team being compromised by the Russian government or Russian agents. That is the issue that was behind that Trump tweet. That is the issue the House Intelligence Committee is supposed to be investigating. That is the issue the Senate Intelligence Committee is investigating. And most troubling for the Trump White House, it is the issue the FBI is investigating. The Trump tweet was then publicly proven untrue by the director of the FBI and the director of the NSA. And all the president's men, which now includes Devin Nunes, everyone at Fox News, and on this particular issue, Rand Paul, they all are now trying to say that Susan Rice did something wrong in her job as National Security Advisor when and if she examined intelligence reports on the Trump team's interactions with foreign governments or foreign agents. Here's what Susan Rice said about this on Andrea Mitchell Reports at 12 noon today.
The allegation is that somehow Obama administration officials utilized intelligence for political purposes. That's absolutely false. I leaked nothing to nobody and never have and never would. There were occasions when I would receive a report in which a U.S. person was referred to, name not provided, just U.S. person. And sometimes in that context, in order to understand the importance of the report and assess its significance, it was necessary to find out or request the information as to who that U.S. official was.
There was not one moment in the Trump presidential campaign where Donald Trump gave the slightest hint that he's capable of faithfully executing any of the duties of the presidency, and there was no moment when Donald Trump said anything to indicate he understood the challenges an American president faces.
Aleppo is a disaster. It's a humanitarian nightmare, but it has fallen from any standpoint. I mean, what do you need, a signed document? Take a look at Aleppo. It is so sad when you see what's happened.
Today, it took the Trump White House about 15 hours to issue a written statement about the worst chemical attack in Syria in the 6 years of the civil war. At least 83 people, including 25 children, died, and at least 350 others were injured in the incident. A senior State Department official said the attack looks like a war crime. The attack comes less than 1 week after the Trump administration said that President Trump accepts the reality of President Assad's continued control of the government in Syria. Here's what the Trump White House said when it finally released a statement. Today's chemical attack in Syria against innocent people, including women and children, is reprehensible and cannot be ignored by the civilized world. These heinous actions by the Bashar al-Assad regime are a consequence of the past administration's weakness and irresolution. President Obama said in 2012 that he would establish a red line against the use of chemical weapons and then did nothing. The United States stands with our allies across the globe to condemn this intolerable attack. In 2013, Donald Trump repeatedly tweeted that President Obama should do nothing in Syria. Quote, "President Obama, do not attack Syria. There is no upside and tremendous downside. Save your powder for another and more important day." In the last hour, Rachel read you tweet upon tweet upon tweet from Donald Trump saying, "Do not go into Syria, do not go into Syria." And of course, the president was prepared to use force in Syria. It was Congress that refused to authorize it. The president had plenty of free time on his hands today to actually speak about Syria, say something, or even tweet about it. But this is what he was doing instead.
They would say there's no way to 270, but there was a way to 306. But wasn't that an exciting one? Huge disadvantage. The Electoral College is very, very tough. They say almost impossible for a Republican to win.
Here's what candidate Trump said about containing North Korea's nuclear ambitions.
You look at North Korea, we're doing nothing there. China should solve that problem for us. China should go into North Korea. China is totally powerful as it relates to North Korea. When they made that horrible deal with Iran, they should have included the fact that they do something with respect to North Korea.
Of course, he'll be saying all that this weekend in his summit with the Chinese president. A senior North Korean defector has told NBC News that North Korea's dictator Kim Jong-un is desperate in maintaining his rule. Tonight, North Korea fired a medium-range ballistic missile into the sea off the Korean peninsula, according to South Korea's military. This weekend, the president will be meeting with the president of China starting on Thursday. President Trump recently told the Financial Times, quote, "If China is not going to solve North Korea, we will." Meanwhile, ISIS has made its first official reference to President Trump. An ISIS spokesman released this statement: "America, you have drowned, and there is no savior. There is no more evidence than the fact that you are being run by an idiot who does not know what Syria or Iraq or Islam is." Joining us now, John McLaughlin, former acting director of the CIA. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Mr. McLaughlin. I just wanted to go, first of all, to the Susan Rice situation. And is there anything that you've heard in that story as it's unfolded today, including what Susan Rice had to say about it, that gives you any concern, or is there any point that you think we should be focusing on or elaborating on in that story?
Well, Lawrence, what I would say, based on Susan's remarks today, and it certainly accords with my experience in government on this issue, is that she was merely doing her job. What happens there is that she's delivered each morning a series of reports. Occasionally, they refer to foreigners contacting Americans about something, and she has the option of asking the FBI or the National Security Agency to, if it can be justified, to let her know who those people are, and often to protect them. Sometimes you want to go to an American and say, you should know who you've been in contact with. Do that quietly. This is not spread around the government, but essentially this is, and it's something that isn't done casually. The people who make decisions about, as they say, unmasking someone have a very high bar for doing that. So I think she was basically just doing her job, as she should have been doing it.
There seems to be something about Susan Rice with Republicans in Washington. We saw Lindsey Graham today come out and say we really should find out what it is that Susan Rice was up to here. Lindsey Graham, whose comments up to now about this have been pretty reasonable. As soon as the name Susan Rice gets mentioned, there's a different reaction. Rand Paul is suddenly jumping in, saying there's something suspicious about this because the name Susan Rice is involved. Do you have any guidance you can give us about why that name sets off Republican Washington the way it does?
Well, I think, you know, I don't have to tell you, Lawrence, that we're living through an extraordinarily partisan time. And if anything, the partisanship has just deepened in the Trump administration as a result of all these controversies. You know, it may be related to the lingering controversy over Benghazi. Who knows exactly why she sets off these reactions. But what I can tell you is that in this case, she was simply doing her job and would have been frankly irresponsible to not take a look at some of these communications, in part to, remember this too, we only have one president at a time, and during this period of time, the Obama administration was still in charge, and in an unusual transition, the Trump administration to be was actually conducting foreign policy. Recall the phone call that Trump made to the leader of Taiwan, basically breaking with the one China policy that had been followed for years, and now that's been repaired, of course. But they were essentially moving into making foreign policy, which typically doesn't happen in a transition. So for that reason alone, someone in the White House might want to know, is there something going on here that affects our conduct of American foreign policy? But to return to my basic point, she was just doing her job here. It's what any national security advisor would have done in the same circumstance.
I want to go to a statement that Rex Tillerson has issued tonight about the North Korean launch. Secretary of State's statement says North Korea launched yet another immediate-range ballistic missile. The United States has spoken enough about North Korea. We have no further comment. And that is the single most extraordinary comment I've ever heard a Secretary of State make. I did not know that there was a limit to what should be said about a particular country, especially one at this particular point of tension.
Yeah, I think North Korea is something I've followed for years. They've done 5 nuclear tests, 3 of them under the current leader. Last one in September had a yield of about the same blast that went off in Hiroshima in World War II. They probably have somewhere between 12 and 20 nuclear weapons. And as I've followed it, they've been working since 1995 or thereabouts on an ICBM that could reach the United States. And they've made enough progress on that. They've got 2 satellites that they've been able to launch with multi-stage missiles. So I think it's fair, I have said and written, that it's likely, more than likely, almost certain that within the term of this president, the 4-year term, this president will have to deal with something that no previous president has had to deal with, and that is an intercontinental ballistic missile in the hands of a North Korean leader, who in this case, by the way, is a much less stable leader than his predecessor or his predecessor. Kim Jong-il, his father, was no friend of ours, but people who met him, no American official has yet to meet the current leader, people who met the father say he was able to understand the world and had a fairly good understanding of what was going on internationally, and if not rational, was certainly not a madman. This current one is an ill-disciplined person who doesn't work very hard, who's emotional, who's carried out purges at a level exceeding anything we've seen in North Korea before. So I think it deserves not only a comment, but careful consideration of policy, because we're going to have to deal with it.
When you look at the overall state of the information that's available now about what was going on between the Russian agents and their attempts to influence our election, especially what could be their contacts with people representing the Trump campaign or close to the Trump campaign, do you have an overall assessment of what you think we're looking at?
You know, in truth, Lawrence, it would be irresponsible for me to sort of speculate about the level of collusion or not in this case. And people who have looked at it, who are privy to all of the classified information, are hesitant to draw conclusions about that, as you've seen in comments from the Senate and comments from the Director of National Intelligence, Clapper, before he retired. But what you see here, though, is we have to remember this is the core of the problem. This is why we have all of this controversy now. We would not be talking about 80% of what we're talking about here in terms of controversy regarding the Trump administration had these things not happened. And what happened? Well, the Russians, without question, hacked into the DNC server and strategically placed information that was detrimental to the Clinton campaign using WikiLeaks as its intermediary. And it hacked into the email of John Podesta and released those things strategically as well. So I think it's fair to say that what's going on here is something that Russia has always done but now has new tools to do. Years ago, they would have had to do this through access agents and physical presence, but now they have the marvelous tool of the internet and social media and a flotilla of trolls that they use to market this material around the world. And also they have an administration that seems more vulnerable to it than in the past. Remember, they tried to do this in another era. They tried to do this during the Reagan administration. They tried to do it during the 2008 election campaign here, but they didn't have the same tools, and they didn't have what seems to be a vulnerability on the part of the Trump campaign. So I can't say whether this is what the investigations have to determine 2 things. First, what did the Russians actually do here? And were there Americans, any Americans, complicit in what they were doing? And we need to get the focus back on that, as opposed to all of these other things that have arisen, largely flowing from the president's foolish tweet some weeks ago.
I think
there's a seeming inability in this. I was thinking today, what is it that's striking about this administration? And there are 3 or 4 things that hit me. One of them, though, is the seeming inability to connect one thing to another. I mean, when he did that tweet, I immediately called a friend and said, okay, we're looking now at weeks, possibly months of turmoil based on something that was a foolish action. And that has in turn deepened partisanship between the 2 parties. And I don't think it's much of a stretch to say it's made it harder for the administration to do everything else it wants to do in domestic areas, such as health care and tax reform. So this failure this inability to connect one action to another is kind of astonishing.
Before you go, could you just give us one more insight into that reference you made to the back when it was the Soviet Union? They were trying to do this back in the Reagan administration. What would be examples of what they were trying to do then in our elective process?
Well, all they were trying to do then was portray Reagan as a warmonger. They were basically trying to say, if he's elected, this will be bad for the world because we will be edging toward war. And that's essentially what they were doing with Hillary Clinton as well. I was in Russia in October before the election. And if you were to look at the press then or the media, the message going to the Russian public was, if Hillary Clinton is elected, get ready for war, prepare your bomb shelter. And I'm not really exaggerating.
John McLaughlin, thank you very much for joining us again tonight with your invaluable insight.